In this session, we deal explicitly with the third part of this series of lectures and discussions on the Emancipation Proclamation. We have already opened up the proclamation itself and what came before. That's the first part. Some extent how it worked. That's the second part. And in this session, we go to the third part, which is "and the what followed" part. One thing that followed is that over the 30 years, more or less, that followed, in other words, from around 1863 or 65, whatever year you choose, up until the late 1890s, there was always a struggle over whether the status of the African Americans, the formerly enslaved, would be, as the proclamation declared, forever free. The reality is that freedom was always under challenge. Among other things, the African Americans were, from the 1890s well into the 20th century, nearly, though not totally, driven out of the process of having anything to do with playing a role in their own government. For a variety of reasons, from the 1930s, they began to be able to re-enter. Political and economic change from the Depression through the Second World War, or until around 1945, began to bring a large black electorate back into the process. That meant that presidents and presidential candidates could and did use identifying with African issues as a way of identifying with black voters in the United States. It became possible to deal with African issues as a way of indicating some sympathy with black people, even when sometimes the domestic policy issues that most concerned them were things that could not be touched. Among other things, then, I should also say that getting an audience for presidents and presidential candidates amongst black voters as a background in the black community that should be mentioned. Number one, there's always some thought somewhere, almost subliminally, about Africa and the debate of whether or not there should be some kind of, quote, back to Africa movement. That never had much appeal, but it was always there. In the early 1920s, that came in very strongly in what was known as the Garvey movement. There's also a part of it that has to do with the missionary side. African American churches have strong African mission efforts. That continues to a certain extent even now. That was somewhere in the background. People were not talking about that every day, but that was somewhere in the background. That then takes us into the period in which we began to talk about African nationalism, African independence, and other similar ideas. That was very much influenced in the 1950s and the 1960s by the fact that the most famous African leaders either were well known through newspapers and magazines or had considerable American experience personally and a good many African American friends. For the symbolism of being well known, the most famous person, of course, was Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, whose country had been attacked by the Italian government in 1936, and the Ethiopian War was something that almost everybody knew something about. Even my small hometown in Mississippi had a ceremony in 1937 when a man named John Robinson, who had been a pilot in the Ethiopian Air Force, which must have been a very small air force, gave flying expeditions at my town. People knew about Haile Selassie. In that sense, they knew about Africa. When you got down to the 1950s, they knew about the most famous American of the time dealing with Africa, to wit, Ralph J. Bunche. If you go on a search today, you will find a ton of material on Bunche, who ended his career as Undersecretary General of the United Nations. He had a variety of other positions in the government going back to the beginning of World War II, and before that was a professor of political science at Howard University in Washington. He was most famous for having won the Nobel Prize when he was the mediator in the dispute between Jewish settlers and Arabs in what is now Israel, and for that became a truly famous figure. Then you begin to get the people who, the first generation of African independence leaders. Some of them went to school in the United States. One of them was a man named Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was the major figure in Ghanaian politics. The country now is called Ghana. In those days, it first was known still as the Gold Coast. Nkrumah had gone to the school in the United States and left, I believe it was Columbia University, and went to work in London for a Gold Coast organization called the United Gold Coast Convention. He went from there, he went back home. And having gone back home, he took over the United Gold Coast Convention, or split off from it, and formed his own organization, the Convention People's Party. They led dramatic activity, strikes, and so on. The British, being in control of the Gold Coast at the time, put him in jail. He pushed right ahead with his political movement, and in 1951, he was let out of prison in order to take office and become a member of the new Gold Coast Parliament with a title called Leader of Government Business. After a while, he became Prime Minister and, in due course, President of the Republic of Ghana. That's a whole other story. Nkrumah was well known to Americans. There were others who were well known to Americans. The man who later became president of Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe, must have spent 10 years or more in the United States as a doctoral candidate and sometimes as a teacher in more than one American university. He went back to Nigeria, which is a big country, deeply involved in politics, a very successful entrepreneur and a very successful politician, became president. Then there were people who were connected to Africa because their own involvements. I would mention here a man named Louis Martin. Lou Martin was a newspaper editor when African-American newspapers were still a substantial business, and he was the executive editor of the Chicago Defender, the president, I believe the title was, of the Sing Stack Publishing Company, the editor of the Michigan Chronicle, and in 1959 he went to Nigeria to aid in the establishment, as a consultant, to aid in the establishment of newspapers for one of the Nigerian political groups, the Yoruba in western Nigeria. I went to Nigeria 20-some years later, and the man who was then the president's press secretary looked at my letter of introduction from Lou Martin, and he said, Louis, our teacher. He had been a young newspaper man when Martin went out to show the Yoruba how newspapers should be set up and operated by his style. That was a deep connection. Martin was deeply involved as well in American politics and so on. There was this American identification with Africa in some way, so that it went far beyond the famous intellectual figures of whom we are aware, of whom the most famous is W.E.B. Du Bois, and the famous theatrical and ideological figure of whom the most famous, by all odds, is Paul Robeson. There was a great deal more. There was that connection into the African American community, so that when it became possible, by the change in the size of the voting population, for presidents and presidential candidates to seek to get some approval, there was a basis for it. I say all that in order to say that we come to today's lecture and to put that African-American connection in the background for the consideration of today's lecture. Against today that, I would just mention then that political scientists who study international relations bring angles of vision to the question of what happened after emancipation, different from other angles of vision that would be brought. Thus, we come to the subject for today's lecture of the civil rights movement and American policy toward decolonization. American policy toward decolonization begins to emerge, even though the term decolonization was not being used, begins to emerge a little bit in the Truman administration, somewhat less in the Eisenhower administration, or in a somewhat different form, and then notably as an issue in the Kennedy administration. That is within the content of the next lecture that will be given by our colleague Stephen Schwark, who is a PhD of government from Harvard, a senior member of the faculty at the University of Illinois Springfield, a diligent and distinguished student of international politics, whose topic is the civil rights movement and American policy toward decolonization.